With all the variables on any given field in any given year, how can a farmer possibly know which tools and practices are working? Spoiler, check strips aren't enough.
If you have like an 80-acre cornfield, if you leave two strips, see, it's fungicide, two strips unsprayed, your error bar is going to be plus or minus 20%. So if that's 200 bushel per acre corn, you really can't be confident of any yield difference that's smaller than 40 bushels per acre.
Physicist Nick Cizek left his job at the Climate Corp and started FarmTest to solve for this. He's also working with others who have interests in making on-farm trials easier, like Mike Castellano of the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative.
We work with companies like FarmTest to work with farmers to deploy hundreds of nitrogen fertilizer rate trials on their farms. So we get these experiments out on farmer fields. They literally hit a button and the experiment gets put out there to help understand what's really been a tough problem for farmers. And that's how much nitrogen to apply and when, where, how to apply it.
It's just going to make sense that every field is going to have one or even more multiple trials in them. And everyone is going to make decisions based on the experiments they did last year. Like, great products are going to see their adoption just accelerate. And that's something that we really look forward to helping make happen.
All right, hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, the farmers, the innovators, the investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. Today's episode is a really unique concept and I would say potential game changer for how we think about on-farm technology, utilization and adoption, management practices, and of course, research. Historically, universities and ag input companies and other agribusinesses ag tech companies also would conduct randomized control trials for the best data on how their products work. But these trials are limited on where they can take place, obviously, and how many replications they could do. So when a farmer says, yeah, that's all great, but what about my field? And what about my management? And what about my operation? It's not surprising that the bottom line comes down to, well, your results might vary. But we don't know for sure and by how much. With advancements, though, in tech, why can't every field include some sort of basic trial to understand how that product is performing? Now, of course, this has been done for years in the past using what we call check strips that a farmer would plant as sort of a control to compare the differences in that field. But this is far from precise or scientific, as you're about to hear. Well, it just so happens that Nick Cizek is a bit of an expert in precision measurement and experimentation design. And he has created in FarmTest a way for farmers and their advisors and also input companies and researchers to run real experiments on farm without interfering with a farmer's operation, with the business they're trying to run. They're essentially increasing the scientific rigor of on-farm trials while removing, or at least drastically reducing, any hassle factor. And today we talked to Nick about that, as well as a user of the FarmTest product, Dr. Mike Castellano of Iowa State University and the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative, which conducted last year 270 unique on-farm trials to collect data so they can analyze nitrogen applications. Mike says that current university nitrogen recommendations are really coarse and really only differ based on broad geographies or whether the crop is coming in after corn or after soybeans. But with this data now, they are already finding consistently predictable differences in fertilizer requirements based on other important factors like soil type, crop residue management, and drainage. This has big ramifications not just for research, but for optimizing individual farm management practices and determining which inputs and technologies should be utilized and where and how much. Obviously, this could also be really handy for input companies to more accurately represent their products because in agriculture, the honest answer to does it work is often it depends. But before we dive in, a little background on these guys. Nick Cizek is an applied physicist specializing in precision measurements. He has a PhD from Stanford. Before founding FarmTest in 2019, he worked for 4.5 years at the Climate Corporation, aka Monsanto, aka Bayer Crop Science. Specifically, he led teams designing and executing in-field trials to measure the performance of advanced nitrogen management systems. He initially joined Climate climate to help design and deploy a sensor network to collect local data to improve the value of their predictive agronomic optimization models. FarmTest now envisions a future where all farms optimize their management practices based on statistically rigorous in-field performance data. FarmTest helps researchers and growers design and analyze statistically robust field trials using commercial farm equipment. They can make this easy by embedding product trials in variable rate prescriptions that account for all of the nuances of each growing operations fields, equipment, management practices, and all the randomization, replication, and blocking needed for statistically sound trial that produces a useful, small, least significant difference. If that sounds very scientific and technical, it is. But the bottom line is the user, the farmer, doesn't need to worry about all that. It's baked into the FarmTest platform. Dr. Mike Castellano's work aims to increase productivity, profitability, and environmental performance of crop production. To achieve these outcomes, he uses a systems approach to strong collaborations with a range of scientists and engineers to track the storage and flow of nutrients, energy, and water through the crop soil system. A range of stakeholders, including government, NGOs, farmers, and industry, regularly engage Mike to help advance sustainable crop production and soil management. His research has led to several public-private partnerships that benefit agriculture and the environment, and he currently serves as the U.S. representative to the United Nations Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils. A couple of years ago, Mike co-founded the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative with his colleague Souteros Arkontoulis, which leverages the latest advances in precision ag and collaborations with farmers to transform the scale of agricultural research. With that, I'm going to drop you into the conversation here where Nick Cizek of FarmTest is explaining more about what led him to the origins of building this company.
I got hired by Climate to figure out what measurements would help farmers. And Climate was owned by Monsanto, and I met a lot of Monsanto customers right away. And I would ask them, well, like, how do you know that Monsanto seeds make you more money? And a lot would say, like, I do some strip trials, or I split my planter on some fields. Or a lot would just say, I know that it works and I trust it. My crop consultant says they work, and that's what I do. While I was there, I quickly realized, like, gosh, there are yield monitors, there are variable rate controllers. We should put this together and make scripts that do experiments. I mean, I'm an experimentalist. I love doing experiments. I love seeing, what really works. So the reason I joined the Nitrogen Advisor team is because they made variable rate prescriptions and they had to prove that those worked. And so a natural way to do that is to take the variable rate script and build into it static rate plots at what the grower would have applied anyway. And so we could really do a randomized controlled trial, like, were we winning compared to what the grower was going to do? And we could make a rigorous comparison. And so we did that for a couple of years, and actually we had quite good success with it. Eventually, I learned it would work better if I was at an independent company. It gets a little tricky to be at a company that manufactures seeds or manufactures fungicide and is also the one that's going to be the trusted tester of whether it pays off or not. So it became clear that it would be easier to be independent, and I could just focus on doing the best trial designs. And then I can test products for companies like that and do a better job. A lot of the trials that people do, if they're not working with a company like us, if you're a farmer or a crop consultant, you'll do, like, say I'm applying fungicide on the field and I will apply it everywhere, but I'll leave 2 strips where I don't apply it. Or I'll do half the field with it and I'll do half the field without. And this could be, I say fungicide, but it could be a microbial fertilizer. It could be any number of inputs. And people don't realize how noisy, how big the uncertainty is on that measurement. So typically, if you have like an 80-acre cornfield with typical yield variability, if you leave 2 strips, say it's fungicide, 2 strips unsprayed, your error bar is going to be plus or minus 20%. So if that's 200 bushel per acre corn, you really can't be confident of any yield difference that's smaller than 40 bushels per acre. And there are a ton of decisions that farmers are trying to make that's much smaller than 40 bushels per acre. And so if that's the tool that you're using, that's like your microscope to understand, am I making the right decision? It's too coarse. And so if you do plot trials, say you take those same 2 half-mile strips and you break them into 16 small plots, you can get down to a 4% error bar. So now you can detect 8 bushels per acre and you could be confident or not. When we do trials with Mike, where we're doing different fertilizer rates, we're changing the rate by 60 pounds of fertilizer per acre. That's a huge difference, and we can detect that. That's very easy to detect, but a lot of our other customers are trying to detect, a 10 bushel per acre difference, and that you need to have lots of plots in order to see that.
Yeah, and it gets back to something we've addressed on the show a few times, which is the last time I can remember it was in the context of measuring soil carbon. It's like, okay, you can get the error really low or the accuracy really, really high with sophisticated academic approaches, but for every commercial farmer in North America to do that, it's unrealistic because it's just either taxing, it takes a lot of time, or it takes a lot of money, or the instrumentation. It sounds like what you're doing with FarmTest a little bit is like automating that process so that it's not a heavy lift for the farmer. Is that right?
That's our goal. Absolutely. We want to make it so that you have to go and apply your fertilizer, or you have to apply your starter, or you have to plant your seeds. And let's do that using a variable rate prescription. So it will automatically build a trial for you. And when you get to the field, it executes. So we work in inputs where you can apply them with a variable rate prescription. And then we work in crops that have a yield monitor, because we don't want someone to have to go out and weigh or anything like that. We just want to make it really easy to collect the data. And so, yeah, we work in crops with yield monitors, and that's the data that we analyze to figure out which of the management practices pays off the best.
And Mike, from your perspective, what attracted you to this idea of what FarmTest was doing for the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative?
Yeah, Tim. So the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative is a public-private partnership that really farmers are the key in this. And we work with companies like FarmTest and others to work with farmers to deploy hundreds of nitrogen fertilizer rate trials on their farms every year. And these are scientifically robust, statistically robust. So we get these experiments out on farmer fields. They literally hit a button and the experiment gets just put out there. We collect the data, and we're using those data to help leverage the latest advances in data sciences, including cropping systems modeling, but other things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, to help understand what's really been a tough problem for farmers. And that's how much nitrogen to apply and when, where, how to apply it. Let me build on a point you made there about the carbon and how with the university trials, you can make a really accurate and precise measurement of how much carbon there is. And with those university trials, we can do the same thing for nitrogen, of course. But the optimum nitrogen rate in a given year, in a given management system across just the state of Iowa varies from less than 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre to well over 350 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And so to reduce that uncertainty, we need more than just academic experiments, because we need to know more than just what the perfect rate is for this location, but we need to be able to forecast and predict locations where we're not measuring and years. And obviously, this is a hindcast is of no use to this, unlike carbon, right? Where we can, knowing the value of carbon is great at the end of the day. That's really where the rubber hits the road. But for nitrogen, you have to forecast it ahead of time. How much am I going to need? And to do that, we really need to link the models and the data. And Nick allows us to, relationships with FarmTest and, places like Premier Crop Systems, they allow us to scale the experiments to hundreds of farmer fields so we can collect that large amount of data to help run these models that can do it.
And what's it look like from you when you're talking to the farmer? I'm sure a question will come up like, okay, I'd like to participate in this initiative because I do, both for my pocketbook and for environmental stewardship, I want to make sure I'm dialing in my nitrogen. What's it going to take from me? How much am I going to have to do to participate? I'm sure you get a question along those lines. And how do you answer that? And I'm curious, within the context of FarmTest, how that answer goes.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things we try and talk through with the farmer is one thing we want to help them to be able to understand and forecast better what their nitrogen needs are. We also want to help them towards identifying management systems that reduce the optimum nitrogen rate per bushel that they're producing, and also reduce the year-to-year and field-to-field variability in that optimum nitrogen rate, and ultimately within field variability as well. And so when we sit down and we think about this question of what are you going to learn and how can we help you better manage nitrogen, they all love that, right? What they don't want to do is get slowed down in the spring at the most critical time of the year to apply that fertilizer and conduct a complicated experiment. The precision fertilizer management, or any variable rate application beyond just nitrogen, allows them to download the prescription from the cloud into their cab. They basically hit go, it gets applied, and then all they have to do is send us that as applied nitrogen map at the end of the season, as well as the harvest data that Nick mentioned are so important. We take those data and we match them up, and that's when we really begin to do the science.
And let's talk about that science. What is the special sauce here that FarmTest is doing? Because we've had variable rate for a while now, and we've had yield data for a while now. So what's the special sauce in the middle that we are really bringing to light that's pushing this forward?
Yeah. So the special sauce is the bridge between the scaling that FarmTest allows us to do to get on hundreds of farmer fields every year, and then taking those data and putting them into a process-based biophysical model that allows us to better forecast optimum nitrogen management, better understand optimum nitrogen management, not only so we can predict, but also manage the system for greater efficiency. And there's really just a great analogy here. I often ask groups I work with, how many people in the audience today have used the biophysical process model? And nobody raises their hand, right? But everybody looked at the weather forecast this morning, And so everybody uses biophysical process models every day. We just don't think about it because they've become so ingrained in our everyday use. And working with companies like FarmTest, that's where we're trying to get in the future, is to make these decisions just, everyday snap decisions.
Tim, could I add one more thing? So Mike and I met when I was working on Nitrogen Advisor. Iowa did some of the test work that built the data set that we were using to train Nitrogen Advisor's model. Part of the inspiration of trying to work with farmers is that, I guess, before I started, as I was getting the battery company going, I consulted at Facebook, and it was at the exact time when they figured out how to label people in pictures automatically. And it's actually a really nice analogy here where what they did is they made it really easy, first of all, to upload people's pictures. Then they made it really easy for people to label people in pictures. Then they said this amazing labeled data set that they could say well, how could we try and automate this? And it turned out at that point in time, there was, big advances in machine learning and deep learning, and that enabled you to actually solve this problem. And now when you presented a new picture with faces in it, it could say oh, that's Nick and that's Mike. But those steps are making it easy to upload the photo, making it easy to label. And Facebook didn't label those photos. They made it so that everyone who was a customer could upload the photos and label it. And then they were the ones who were able to kind of make this auto labeling feature. And I think where ag is that we've made it easy to upload data. So that's kind of like uploading the photos, but we don't have this step yet where we are labeling the data. And that's why what I'm really excited about working with someone like Mike is when you design these trials, what we're doing is in this analogy, you have to have more than one management practice in the field in order to be able to label the data. And so we put more than one management practice in the field. We get a really good side-by-side comparison of those. In Mike's case, we get 5 different rates that we get really good comparisons between those. And that's sort of the equivalent of labeling the data. And then Mike's team takes that labeled data set that stretches over many years and over all sorts of different fields and geographies and sets of management practices. And they can now say, okay, given that beautiful labeled data set, what thing works the best? And it's very analogous to this this Facebook problem that has been solved. And if we get enough data, we will solve this problem too.
But yeah, Nick, I think that's exactly it, right? And just to go back to the weather forecast analogy, weather forecasts had terrible skill for 3-4 day forecasts until we started collecting a lot of observational data and having the computer capacity to run those process models we talked about to make use of those data for better forecasts.
So in this case, if I'm a farmer and I'm listening, I'm thinking, okay, the idea here is to automate the process of doing these trials on my farm with the goal of ultimately kind of finding optimal numbers, but it's also a dynamic and changing system. So do we ever arrive there, or am I just always doing these trials? And if so, am I sacrificing short-term optimization? I don't know if that makes sense in order to do those trials to get to some distant optimal future. How do you kind of reconcile that?
Yeah. So I guess first of all, we do sell direct to farmers at FarmTest, but most of our customers are actually crop consultants who the farmers have hired to help them. Or it's like a big farm that has an on-staff agronomist, something like that. That seems to work better historically for us. But sorry, the other part about your question about the learning part. So we have had to build into our tool a place that explicitly addresses this, where when you're designing the trial, the last thing that you set in it is you say what percent of the field do you want to be what you normally do, and what percent of the field can be test plots. And it's because we're trying to make it so you can hit that balance. And so we try and highlight so you know, okay, if I put 7 replicates in this field, I can get I think I'll be able to detect 15 bushel per acre difference. But if I increase the amount of test area in the field, decrease my nominal area, but I get more test plots, I can get that down to 7 bushels per acre. I'm just making up numbers here, but we try and make that easier for people to make that trade-off. But it's a big question because a lot of our customers are managing actually pretty well, and there's a chance that they're losing money on those parts of the field. And I guess that also comes back to then the reason, but a difference between plots and strips. We talked about 2 strips and then breaking it up into 16 plots and the advantage you get there. But if you were to take like a whole field and put it into alternating strips, if you broke those into smaller plots, like we were talking about, you could probably get away with maybe half the field or 40% of the field being in those small plots. And so you could reduce your risk by 60% in that way by going to plots instead of strips.
One thing I want to add too, in terms of the state university, the land grant university perspective on this, there's a common good here as well. And that is to demonstrate how efficient U.S. farmers are, and particularly Iowa farmers are in the case of the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. And having those data transparent and open to the public are really important as we start to value the environmental outcomes of U.S. agriculture and crop production. When we look at things like scoring the carbon intensity of our crops, over 70% of the carbon intensity score from the production of a bushel of corn comes from nitrogen, whether it's N2O emissions from the field or the energy embedded in the fertilizer that is applied to the field. Same thing even for soybeans, which typically does not receive nitrogen fertilizer. Over 70% from nitrous oxide emissions and the small amount of fertilizer that soybeans do receive. So having these data publicly available allows farmers not just to benchmark themselves against the average, but also to benchmark U.S. agriculture and demonstrate how efficient we are.
And Nick, getting back to your last point about kind of strips versus these, what we're calling scripted plot trials, right? It's kind of what we're calling what FarmTest does. Is some of the key here in where FarmTest decides that these trials should take place to make sure they are in some ways randomized, but also representative, so that you don't just have it, let's say, in a low-lying area, or vice versa? Is that part of the key here?
Yeah, that's right. So when we make a prescription, it needs to be scientific, but the first thing is it has to work. And so first of all, we take into account the constraints of the machine equipment that will be executing the trial. So that would include, for example, like, does the combine and the sprayer have RTK or not? If they do, we can make the plot smaller and get a more precise trial. If they don't, the plots have to be wider. It's not like rocket science, but you just have to take those sort of things into account. The length of the plots depends on how new the equipment is. If it's older, and also how much people calibrate it. But newer equipment, generally we can make the plot smaller. Older equipment, it has to be bigger. So we take into account the constraints of the equipment. We take into account the constraints of the field, and also the management practices. Like, there always are like things where we have to change it in these ways to make it match what they want. And then we also build in the goals of the trial, and we build in the principles of statistical trial design. So randomization, blocking, replication, all that gets built into that script. So as the operator, you don't have to think about that. You can just create the trial design, create the shapefile, load it in the rate controller, and go. If I could say one more thing related to this, as a physicist, I'm used to doing, a lot of times you can do measurements where you know what the answer is, and you can test if your measurements work. So if you want to measure a thermometer, how well it works, you can boil water, so you know the temperature, and you can drop a known amount of ice in, and you can know how much it's supposed to reduce the temperature. And then you put your thermometer in and you see like, oh, it's supposed to reduce it by 5 Celsius. But if you put it in and you see like, oh, it only reduced it by 4, then you can calibrate your thermometer. In ag, there aren't those calibrated standards. You can't apply something in the field and know this is going to raise my yield by 10 bushels per acre. If we had that, it would be amazing, but we don't have that. And so instead, the closest we've been able to find is that you can take a field where you've never done a trial, and you can take your algorithm for placing plots and you can pretend you did a trial and design it and analyze it as if you had done the trial and see what yield difference you measure. And if your algorithm is good, you're going to measure really close to 0. And so we've tried a lot of different ways to place the plots. The one that we use is the one that we think is the best for that.
And obviously, in Mike's case, they have a really clear research question here. Is that imperative to get value from FarmTest for other, agronomists or crop consultants that are using it?
I would say, yeah. I mean, the trials that people do with us are usually like, I want to know if I can lower my soybean seeding rate. I was doing 180,000 seeds per acre 5 years ago. I'm at 140 now, and I want to see, can I do 120 or can I do 110? And so it's usually pretty directed. And we're typically steering people towards doing fewer treatments and more replicates because we really want to give them a statistically significant results, either on that field or across a couple fields on their farm. We want, at least at the growing operation, that you can say, which of these makes me the most money? And it's sort of a bad day for us if we don't get enough replicates in there and someone can't actually say, did this either raise my yield or did I make more money on it?
We've talked about how just because something works on a farm doesn't mean it works on my farm. And that's been a little bit difficult to kind of determine, on a consistent basis from farmers. So maybe talk about how a tool like FarmTest might help a crop consultant, agronomist, or even a farmer kind of get the information they need to make their own decisions.
Historically, if you were relying on strip trials, we've already talked about how noisy they are. And in the past, they were even noisier because yield monitors have improved a ton over the last 20 years. And so if you were relying on that for your source of like which decision you should make, and you're doing like a strip trial or a split field trial, it actually, in many cases, the best data on whether something would work on your farm is coming from the input companies who have done these really precise, replicated small plot trials. And they may not be exactly on your farm, but maybe they're in your county or your part of the state. And that maybe gives you the best data on whether it should work on your farm or not, on this specific field or not even. But I guess we're building on 30 years of precision ag advancements. We have much better yield monitors. We have variable rate controllers. We have trial design software. We have RTK and differential GPS, and we have row by row control and wireless data transfer to and from the cloud. Like all those things make it where now suddenly we're on the cusp of where it's getting easier and easier for farmers and their trusted advisors to do the trials. And what's going to happen is there's been this sort of information asymmetry where it used to be that the farmers relied on the input companies on what would work. And now it seems like it's going to start shifting where the growers and their trusted advisors are going to have the data, at least for on my fields, on my farms, what works the best. And so that's going to really change the way the ag supply chain works. And the exact ramifications, I don't know exactly, but I can tell you like it should scramble things up. It'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah. Well, population's a great example. Obviously, we've been talking about nitrogen. You also mentioned fungicide. Are there other examples that are top of mind for you that you could throw out that might, resonate with somebody listening? Like, oh yeah, that's something I'm working on.
Well, there's all kinds of fertilizers now. Like I hear a lot about sulfur now, iron. There's lots of different types of fertilizers. The other is obviously all the microbes and biostimulants. So we end up helping people do a lot of tests of those. The other would be proprietary fertilizers. Like I normally provide, do a generic phosphorus, but I want to compare that to one that's supposed to be more bioavailable. And so we can do like a treatment with the normal phosphorus, 40 pounds less, and then apply the better one at 40 pounds less and see do you get a better result.
I'd add to that one thing we didn't discuss, Tim, that I think is pretty interesting. A lot of these products, they promise relatively small benefits compared to the certainty or uncertainty we have in the current management system. So for example, nitrogen management right now, we cannot predict the optimum nitrogen rate plus or minus 50 pounds per acre. If we can't do that, it really holds back the potential that those products that provide a small but meaningful amount of nitrogen to the crops can provide.
Something you just said made me recall we've had some nitrogen use efficiency type companies on this show. And what's interesting is, a lot of their value proposition is, using this, you can use less nitrogen. But then you talk to a lot of farmers that are using it and they're not using less nitrogen. They're just hoping for more yield. And so I would think using something like FarmTest would give you a lot better picture of like, maybe I should have reduced my nitrogen as one example with this product. And I didn't. I don't know. I could definitely see applications that way. And also you've got companies out there trying to make guarantees of saying like, look, we want to take some of the risk with farmer customers. But in order to do that, I would think you would need something like this to accurately attribute what came from the product versus what came from Mother Nature or something else.
Yeah, Tim, and strip trials are not particularly good at that because there are limitations in treatments. Whereas working on these variable rate prescription-based experiments, you can really home in on the real factor that you're looking to understand.
And I don't know, I know last year sounds like was the first year you did all these. And Nick, I know you're just really starting your big commercial push on this, but are there any specific examples of one of the farmers you're working with, Mike, or it may be a crop consultant you might be working with of like, based on the trial they ran this year, they're really, changing their approach the next year? Do we have any sort of big transformation stories, for lack of a better term, or is that not really the way things work, or is it usually kind of tweaks over time?
No, Tim, there's some immediate impacts, I'd say for sure, in the work we're doing with FarmTest and others. And a big obvious one that may strike people as obvious right off the bat, but actually has had a lot of impact, is that heavily manured fields, you probably could back off a little bit further on the synthetic nitrogen application than previously thought. The manured, it builds up organic matter over time, and those fields do require a little bit less nitrogen than maybe we thought.
And Nick, anything you want to add to that?
One that just jumps to my mind is we've worked with some input companies, and they have tried some things, and it's not only them, but also investors in these companies have run experiments with us, and that they say like this affects the way we invest our dollars in future years, seeing the results of these trials. So,
well, yeah, Tim. I just emphasized the point I made earlier about the uncertainty in these products in terms of what they're trying to provide in the context of what we can measure now. And this is just really a transformation in helping to enable these products really to take off and be implemented with greater certainty.
Yeah, if you're an input provider, you can imagine you've got this new fertilizer and it's supposed to lift yield by 10 bushels per acre. But if you're doing strip trials and the error is plus or minus 40 bushels, it's slightly better than flipping a coin. It's not a lot better than that. And if you have this product and you have a runway of a certain number of years of funding raised, like you would benefit from good trials that really show that what you're doing works, and not that you have to kind of rely on these coin flips to show that it works. You have to do a lot of coin flips basically if you're not doing a more precise trial.
And I'd add to that a further complication, Tim, especially with nitrogen and other fertilizers, is you always know when you're doing a good job. If you over apply, there's almost no consequence other than the environmental consequences, which I'm not minimizing, right? There's serious consequences, but they don't necessarily have a really noticeable effect on your bottom line, maybe in just 1 year. And they certainly don't have a visually noticeable effect on the crop. It's only when you under apply. And so that often leads to too much input.
Well, as we're kind of getting to the home stretch here, I want to talk about, kind of impact. And the show is called Future of Agriculture. So I'm always looking at what's happening today and trying to project that out of like, what impact does this have going forward? And so maybe we'll start with the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. I really enjoyed learning more about that, Mike. Can you just talk about where it is today and what impact you hope kind of this has going forward?
Yeah, sure. So where things are right now with nitrogen management in the Corn Belt is that each state has its own recommendation, and it's really just based on a very limited number of university experiments, maybe 10 or 15 a year, and they prescribe one rate for corn following corn, one rate for corn following soybeans. Maybe they have 2 or 3 different geographies within their state for those different areas. And then the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative in 2023, we had 270 trials in partnership with 72 farmers. And taking those data, we're really allowing us to make much more fine-scale recommendations for different soil types, different management practices in the state. In particular, residue management and drainage management have big effects on not only how much nitrogen fertilizer to apply, but also the year-to-year variability in that optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate. They can make significant reductions in that, reducing farmer risk. As the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative continues and moves forward, the next step is to develop predictive and forecast-based tools that'll help farmers really identify on a probability-based range what the right nitrogen rate is for that field. And then moving forward, we'll eventually get to weather years as well and in-season management. That's probably 5+ years down the road.
Very cool. And more on the FarmTest side, Nick, how about for you? Where are we at currently with FarmTest, and what does that look like in the coming years and the impact you're hoping it has?
We're one of the companies that's helping them create this data set that they're going to use to make predictive models. Right now, we're really focused on designing trials that make it clear on this field, on this year, what pays off the best. But we also are creating this really well-curated data set. So say we have a crop consultant who's our customer. They are running trials in their geography, and they are doing nitrogen trials and fungicide trials and seeding rate trials. But we are helping them build up a data set for their area that then eventually we too would like to help them train models. And so that they can better help the customers in their area with, on these 4 fields, you should apply a fungicide, but these 3, you should not because it's sandier soil or the weather pattern is slightly different, something like that. And so eventually we would like to help make those data sets and help agronomists and university researchers and retailers and farmers monetize those and make better decisions. And so not just on net nitrogen, but beyond that to seeding rate, fungicide, microbes, other fertilizers, et cetera. I guess we also think if we can make it easy enough to do trials, and this isn't just FarmTest, but across this space of people making it easier to do on-farm research, it's going to get easier and easier to do these trials. And eventually, it's just going to make sense that every field is going to have one or even more multiple trials in them. And that is just going to be part of doing business. And everyone is going to make decisions based on the experiments they did last year. And great products are going to see their adoption just accelerate. And that's something that we really look forward to helping make happen.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you very much to they're both doctors, Dr. Nick Cizek and Dr. Mike Castellano, for being on the show. Highly recommend you look at the show notes and go to their website for FarmTest. It's just farmtest.ag. Also for the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. I think this is a very leading research effort in a very, very important area. So it's cool that we can kind of capture both stories in one episode, and it's neat to see the technology we're featuring in FarmTest in practice to really make some impactful research happen on farms. What do you think about this? I mean, do you think this is something that could spread to the average farm, either through a crop consultant agronomist type or through research collaborations or just through farmer interest? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at Tim Hamrich. You can DM me on LinkedIn and email me, tim@aggrad.com. I really appreciate hearing from each and every one of you every time that I do. Thank you so much for your feedback. And thank you, as always, for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.